Okay, and we've got our buttons, so ready, and in just a few seconds, you're live.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Everyone who is here. I'm Allan Batchelder, and I am the author of the series Immortal Treachery, which begins with Steel, Blood, and Fire. I'll be reading the beginning of that today. I'm showing you that because I have a background, but for some reason this is cropped off, and this is the last book in my series, and that's cropped off the image as well. So, and I want to talk a little bit about what you're going to be hearing today and why I chose to do it that way. Let's see. We're live. I see, okay, several people watching. Excellent. So I started this series started writing it in 2012. And I wanted to do something a little different, at least as far as my reading experience was concerned. And that was, I wanted to start with my protagonist, who's really an anti-hero, as you'll soon discover. I wanted to start with him at a terribly low point in his story, so that the reader might be compelled to wonder, well, how on earth is he going to survive this? Where can the story possibly go from here? And so when we first encountered Tarman Vikers, he is being tortured in the stocks by virtually everyone in town, and things rapidly go downhill from there. And then we segue to one of my female leads. Her name is Aoife, and she has a particular mission. And so I thought I would read a bit of that to you today, and then answer any questions you may have. I'm just going to be reading right off my screen and fooling around a bit in dialect so you can differentiate between some of the characters. So again, the character's name is Tarman Vikers, and it starts Chapter 1, Vikers in the Stocks. The beatings and abuse continued without pause, without end, due in no small part to the efforts of the two Ashe on either side of him, who had surely forsworn their sacred trust in prolonging his misery. He had hoped for, even expected, death by the end of his first day. But the Duke, the people of the Reaches, and his healers would not be satisfied until the last victim had exacted his just measure of vengeance. An all too familiar speech interrupted his reverie. "You may strike him once," one of the guards told the next in line. "However you like. If your blow's the one kills him, though, you'll be whipped on this same post. Do you understand?" Aye. Of course. They all understood. They were artists of understanding by now. And so he'd been punched, slapped, scratched, kicked, stabbed with needles in non-vital areas, spat upon, burned, and had various things thrown on him, from rotten blood to urine, feces, vomit, and offal. It was a masterpiece of the people's understanding, and still death would not come, nor the lines of peasants abate. He could endure the physical torture. What choice did he have? But the constant insults and taunting were harder to ignore. He'd been a proud man once. Worse than the beatings and the verbal abuse, however, were the flies. There must, he concluded, have been one for each person he'd killed over the years. Perhaps these flies were even the shades of those unhappy dead come back to join in the festivities. They made him itch something fierce. The only accidental mercy he enjoyed was that he'd been hung up facing west, and for a few brief minutes that sunset was in his eyes, he could see nothing. But perhaps blindness had put him here in the first place. One morning, he was awakened, shocking enough that he'd been asleep, with a crash of salt water, the cold of it practically stopping his heart and the salt burning his countless wounds like hellfire. Miraculously, he found himself alone, or nearly so. "You look like shit, Vikers. Smell like it, too." It was Captain Brandt again, backed by a number of silent soldiers. "'Course most of it probably is shit, but you get my meaning." The best the Reaper could manage was to grunt in reply. "I guess we all thought you'd be dead by now." Vikers was silent this time. No need to respond to such an obvious truth. "There's no good news for you there, though. His lordship says you're to live, after a fashion." Brandt was setting him up. Vikers wouldn't give him the satisfaction. "We're taking your hands and feet, Reaper, and then we're dumping you in the woods." Vikers looked up inquiringly. Brandt shrugged. "His lordship thinks there may come a day when someone will have need of your talents. If you're still alive, that is." Finally, Viker spoke. "That's bad strategy." "No shit. And I told him so, but he's convinced you'll be tractable." The captain reached over and unlocked the mechanism holding Vikers in place. Slowly, the prisoner stood up. "Enjoy it, Vikers. You won't be so tall in a few moments' time." The odd sensation in his gut was fear, he realized. The first he'd felt in ages. He simply couldn't or didn't want to imagine life without hands or feet. His lordship had finally accomplished what thousands of angry peasants could not. He had made Vikers feel something. The actual taking of his hands and feet was more psychologically painful than physically so. The terror as the axe swooped down and parted his flesh was unlike anything he'd ever known. The pain was less significant for a while. This time, the healers took no special care to sustain him beyond cauterizing and wrapping his wounds. Watching them gather his hands and feet into a bucket and carry them off, Vikers felt unspeakable loss. He spent the entire journey into the wilds in a semi-conscious fog in the back of an old wagon that must once have been used to transport pickled herring. The smell and the rough jostling made him violently ill, and along with the weakness, fever, and pain he was already feeling, he again found himself wishing, yearning for death. This was immeasurably harder to endure than those days of beatings and insults in the public square. He almost laughed at the thought of it. Almost. He must have lost consciousness because the next thing he knew, he was crashing to the ground in a dark forest. The shadow of a man stood between him and the last of the day's light. "See you in hell, Vikers." "Oh, you'll be there too." A moment of angry silence, and then Vikers felt a boot to his face. He might have lost a tooth. Another one. There was a bit of rustling, and then he felt hot liquid pouring onto his head. Piss. The fat man laughed. Vikers shut him out and went back to sleep. Aoife, on her mission. She felt, spent most of her life second-guessing herself. Standing out of the rain under an old cedar by the side of the road, her mind circled back inevitably to the same conclusion. She should have killed him when she had the chance. And the same old retort tried to rescue her. How can a 10-year-old girl be expected to murder her little brother? There was no way to answer these thoughts. She had tried for years. She was damned when he became. She gasped. Sometimes when she was wrapped up in these thoughts, she forgot to breathe. Or was that self-sabotage? Anyway, she sighed, shouldered her pack, and set off again, hoping to make the next village by nightfall. A fire would be heavenly. and something to eat, something hot. She wouldn't be picky. Of course, she felt guilt as she noticed the telltale scars of war on the landscape. But it had been a while. Maybe things were on the mend locally, and folks had begun to forget. Until he returned. Gods, it was driving her mad. She needed to visit an herbalist. More than fire or food, she hoped the nearest settlement had an herbalist. Even a hedge witch would do. She had to quell these nagging recriminations or she would lose her mind. Blessing, sister, walk with you. She turned. A withered old man in tattered clothing hobbled towards her. Best to have company along these roads nowadays. Certainly, friend, certainly, and welcome. Welcome indeed. Anything, anyone to wrench her mind from its present self-abuse. Spreading a word then, are you? The old man asked. That's been done, I think, she responded. I'm more for ministering to the sick. He laughed. Plenty of work for you in town then, no shortage. And you? What brings you onto the road at this hour? Was told there was a mender approaching, and I came out searching to be your escort like. But wouldn't they send the... I am the captain of the guard. That stopped her in her tracks. The old man shrugged apologetically. Times ain't what they ought to be. Everything made her feel guilty. What's the population of your town, sir, Captain? 1,000, give or take. And how many men amongst you? Of shaving and sword-bearing age? Maybe 60. She reeled. But 60? Oh, there'll be a couple hundred boys, surely, but we're letting them be boys for the nonce. All the rest, yes, I know, Captain, she said, a little more sharply than she'd intended. The wars have been evil. Inexcusably, unforgivably evil. That they have, was all he said before falling silent. Up ahead, she saw the silhouettes of cottages in the gloom. Vikers woke up with dirt in his eyes. It took him a moment, but he dimly remembered crawling into an old log at some point. He was more thirsty than he'd ever been in his life, even more than in his various campaigns across numerous deserts, even more than during his recent days-long torture in the square of that nameless village. Thirst was a demon inside him. He felt if he didn't get water in the next few minutes, he'd be dead within the hour. He tried to move and was blindsided by an avalanche of pain. That's right. They destroyed him, taken his hands and feet. The stumps were itching and burning and throbbing all at once. It was by sheer force of will that he clung to consciousness and sanity. Water first. Nothing else mattered. I think I'm going to stop there. I don't want to overdo it or over-explain.
Do you want it to be time for questions?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. If there are questions, or I can talk more about the arc of the story.
We've got one question to start you off with.
Oh, great.
It's from P.S. Livingston, and she asks, do you hear your characters' accents when you write?
You know, that's a funny question because Joe Abercrombie, by the way, I'm in Seattle, Washington, for those of you who are in other parts of the world. And Joe Abercrombie came to town a few years ago, and I asked him the same question. And I do. I have kind of unusual background. Professional actor by trade, or I started out that way, and much of my training was by British actors or English theater practitioners. And so I started out in Shakespeare and doing a lot of Shaw and whatnot, and I've come to develop a real affinity for it, the musicality of it, and it just seems a more natural thing for me than, say, Appalachian dialect, or Seattle, Washington, where we have very hard R's. I'm going to the store. We're like pirates up here. Yes, I do. I do. And the trouble is there are so many and so many different and distinct ones that you really have to constantly revisit them and study them in order to remember them. And I'm always astounded by English actors like Hugh Laurie, for example, or really any English actor who pulls off the sort of generic American well, because I'm just terribly self-conscious. If I were on English TV, I would have a nervous breakdown trying to sound.
Yeah, that can be nerve-wracking for sure. I was in a period play a couple of years ago, and it was a lead role, and I was supposed to be use 1910s RP, and I just for the entire time, and of course, I'm familiar with it, but geez, keeping it up for 90 minutes. It was a fringe play, so it was short, but keeping it up for 90 minutes and trying, thank goodness I'm just here in Winnipeg. If I'd had actual British people around, I would have, died of embarrassment.
Yeah. So imagine, I mean, the head of my program was Tony Church, who was one of the founders of the Royal Shakespeare Company. So when we did a Shaw play, I just felt terribly self-conscious, but I seem to have pulled it off. But that was many, many years ago. And this is mostly what I'm doing nowadays is writing. In fact, on my other monitor here, I have my work in progress. So this first started out as a single standalone novel, but I got about halfway into it and I realized that the characters had so much more to say, and some of the characters kind of spontaneously appeared in the story. And one of the common questions that writers often get is, are you a plotter or a pantser? And I think the most common answer is, well, it's a little bit of both. And so for me, I know typically how a story opens and I know how it ends. And I know several highlights along the way, but other things come out completely out of left field. And I've learned to accept those things as just part of who I am and my style. And when I was a lot younger, I took a playwriting class from a very successful and sort of nationally renowned playwright. And he talked about being careful not to write from on high, this position where you're trying to control everything your characters say and everything they do and fit the neatly prescribed space that you have conceived for them. And to me, this is another thing I discovered in acting, that often the contradictions in your character are the character. And that's not to say that you should make every choice contradiction to every previous choice, because then you've got somebody with serious mental issues. But even a horrendous villain can have a moment of tenderness. Even the naive waif-like character can have a moment of viciousness or brutality. So,
which actually that leads nicely into another audience question.
Great.
Which was that your characters seem pretty morally gray. Is that something you enjoy in characters?
I do. I grew up reading, like everyone of my generation, I think, The Lord of the Rings and The Once and Future King by E.B. White. And then I got into the Elric saga, and I read all of Raymond Feist, and I adored Raymond Feist. But the older I got and the more I kind of looked at the world I'm in, the more I became enamored with this nebulous moral situation that we kind of find ourselves in. And you see that quite a bit in George R.R. Martin, and you see in Joe Abercrombie. And it just appeals to me. And I don't frankly know whether that's I'm a teacher too, so we talk about things that are age appropriate or developmentally appropriate. I don't know whether my interest in what we call grimdark, this moral ambiguity, is a result of my age. Now I'm going to be 59 next week, or if it's just that I've read everything else and this is the newest thing that I've landed on.
That's always an interesting question. I think I went through a phase where I really enjoyed reading George R. R. Martin's books, and now, particularly in a pandemic and a lot of horrible things happening in the past year, I've like moved away from it. I want some more of those noble characters back, because there's too much morally gray in the real world for me at the moment. But I find it's interesting how I think all of us as writers and readers go through cycles of where those things are more the thing that we want, or less the thing that we want.
Well, and I think too, sort of the politics of the last several years in my country anyway, really divided us, but they've also shown us situations like, well, people often say, I don't want to vote for the lesser of two evils, which implies that we have two evil people, as and which one is less unthinkable than the other. Yeah, there is a genre called noble bright, which I know nothing about, which is reputed to be sort of the opposite of grimdark. And
it's been it actually came up, noble bright came up in one of the earlier panels and mentioned as a slightly troubling, in that it seemed to be turning back to the idea of a very hard distinction between good and evil, and thus the othering of bad guys, which was a trope that was brought up in under the tropes, the good, the bad, the ugly, and how that can be problematic, because if you make it so that the people you're fighting against are considered inhuman, which is of course what we usually do for actual enemies, right? Like, it's a big part of military training is embracing that mentality.
Oh, absolutely. The dehumanizing of the enemy. Yeah.
But that then when we do that in fiction, that can lead to a lot of problems. So I think it's interesting, because grimdark has like a lot of benefits in terms of the philosophy of like, yeah, people sometimes are just like, they're not evil and they're not great, they're just people, and they can do any of those things. They can be evil briefly or be good briefly. And I've always loved that about grimdark. It's just more just like right now I want like comfort stories instead of
well, so in that sense, maybe I'm kind of a hybrid, because there are moments of beauty, there are a few moments here and there across the whole 750,000 words. Good guy wins. But the thing with me about the hard black and white, the hard good and evil, is it leaves no room for redemption. There's no room for the bad guy. In this case, my story has two bad guys. Tarman Vikers is a bad guy. He's the hero of the story. It leaves no room for the bad guy to ever do the right thing, because you're going to be judging him for much of the story as kind of evil. Then how is it then at the end of the whole saga that he may or may not do something that is unabashedly good? So I think of someone like Sidney Carton in Tale of Two Cities, who's just a complete wastrel, a sarcastic, mean, selfish jerk but then at the end of Tale of Two Cities, he makes one of the most memorable moments in literature in this great instance of self-sacrifice. So those are the kinds of things that I find really compelling, and that I aspire to recreate in my own work, if at all possible.
Those are interesting too, because it's I think they raise interesting questions about whether or not that last action actually redeems the character, or if it is just a one good action that yes, that action was good. Does it make that person good? And there's a lot of complexity to that, and I think it's addressed differently in different books, and that's an interesting thing to look at and assess. So it can be a really useful tool.
I guess the other question is, if it doesn't redeem the character, does it matter if if it creates happy circumstances for, you know, a large number of other people. In the case of Sidney Carton, spoiler alert.
On the Tale of Two Cities, I think we're past the date on that. It should be okay.
Okay, yeah. He saves the marriage and romance and keeps a family intact.
Right.
He could never be a part of. So that's something of a noble sacrifice, I guess. If he doesn't live beyond it.
Yeah.
Any other questions? I certainly have.
We have two more questions. We have one from Jessica Halsey, which is, who is your favorite character? And yes, it is that broad. So I go to town, I guess.
Wow. Who is my favorite character? Geez, I have a lot of them within this genre. I love, there's a character named Karsa Orlong in the Malazan Book of the Fallen. He's a giant, and he he has his own book in this 10-book series in which he's pretty loathsome for much of it. But then he ends up doing some good things later on. I love a lot of Abercrombie's characters. I love the Bloody Nine. I love Glocta, the Inquisitor torturer. But I also love some of his female characters. I'm blanking on their names at the moment, but he writes really good, strong female characters. You know, I love what George R.R. Martin did. He did kind of a jujitsu thing with Jaime Lannister too, where we hate him. You know, when we first meet him, what sleazy dirtbag, you know, and he tries to kill the boy, and then by the end, you're sympathizing with the guy. You're caring about his fate, and you want him to survive. And he seems like you maybe even want him to get together with Brienne of Tarth or whatever. So, just characters. I love Elric. I love Aragorn. I've tried to write some really strong female characters too. I have a queen who's kind of remotely based on Elizabeth I of England. And I have a giantess named Mardine. She's a really cool character. Gosh, I know you asked for a character, but it's like favorite flavor of ice cream. My favorite flavor of ice cream is whatever's right in front of me. Obviously, I'm not the most slender of individuals, so yeah.
That's not to be held against you, but yes, and any ice cream is yeah, I agree. The ice cream in front of me is my favorite flavor of ice cream generally. And yeah, I don't like anytime anyone asks me those questions, like, what is your top whatever? Like, I don't have I can give you maybe a top 10, but that'll change by the time I'm done like saying the list out loud. Yeah, it's always hard to pin down a favorite. So I think it's totally fair that you included a smattering of, of characters from all over. An additional question we have from P.S. Livingston is, writing a character with no hands or feet must be challenging. Did you have to do much research with regards to how they'd cope or how their movement would change?
No, because well, I don't spoil it too much, but he doesn't.
Magical spoiler.
Yeah, he yeah, I don't want to spoil it.
Okay.
Yeah,
I have a guess, but yeah.
But I have.
In other words, you didn't wind up having to deal with that long term.
No, but I have broken. I've broken a hand and I've broken a foot before, and so it's not quite the same. But when suddenly you have no use of it whatsoever for whatever period of time, you can kind of anticipate. Okay, if all four of these were out of action, what would that be like? It's funny. I do a lot of research. I'm writing something about right now about Jamestown, the original English colony in North America, and I've just been research out the ears on that. So there are some things where you just have to go off into the weeds forever, as you sure you know, and then there are other things where you have a pretty good idea and you have to use your imagination a little bit.
Fair enough. Well, I believe, well, we've got a minute left. Would you like to point anyone in the direction of your current and future works? I already listed the Amazon link for book 1 of that series, the one you just read from, in the chat, so people can find that there. But is there anywhere else you'd like to direct the audience to find out more about you and your books?
Well, I have a website called immortaltreachery.com. And there's also an Immortal Treachery Facebook page. And I put all kinds of related content. It's not just about my book, but I post other authors. If there's an archaeological discovery that pops up, I post those, or if there's a new torture device. I mean, I just have really wide interests. I'm also very interested in horror as a genre, big fan. And so I just try to put up stuff for general consumption and not so much buy my book.
Right.
Book. So
good. That sounds like
yeah.
a pleasant collection of things, or perhaps unpleasant with the torture and whatnot, but at least a curated list. Sorry for the sound.
Hey, I'm a middle school teacher. I know all about torture.
Indeed. Well, I taught middle school for 1 year only out of my entire teaching career, and it made me wish to quit teaching. But that's because I'm a high school teacher at heart, and it was just the wrong place for me. But thank you so much for joining us and reading, and thanks everyone in the audience for showing up and asking questions. Lovely to have you all here. And everyone go check out the rest of Allan's books and the website and Facebook page he just mentioned. And we'll all see you. I believe the next event I am supposed to mention is the female-led fantasy panel starting at 8 p.m. Central Time. So we'll see you all there. Thanks so much, and enjoy your con, everyone.
Cool. Thank you very much.